Under the scorching sun of Golgotha, a young man in the prime of his life was carrying a heavy cross uphill. The time for the crucifixion was approaching. The Roman soldiers laid the martyr on the cross, driving nails into his hands and feet to hold him, and mockingly placed a crown of thorns on his head. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they shouted. At the base of the cross, the inscription "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews" was barely visible. The sun disappeared and the sky darkened. Darkness enveloped the faces of the gathered crowd, groaning under their Messiah. 3 hours later, he left the world of the living. Shortly after, one of Christ's secret followers, Joseph of Arimathea, asked Pontius Pilate for permission to bury the body, and upon receiving it, he wrapped it in a shroud and placed it in a secret tomb. A shroud that to this day many believe bears the image of Christ.
Is it all true? We will find out together in the new episode of Secret Origins. Welcome.
You have just heard the well-known story of the crucifixion of Christ by Pontius Pilate. It is attested in the New Testament and is detailed in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Today, we will not only delve into the reasons leading up to this event, or who was behind the execution of the Son of God.
Today, the topic is the mentioned shroud in which Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of the Messiah. We find this description in the Gospel of Mark 15:43-47. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, boldly went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought a linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, saw where he was laid. The shroud in question is known as the Shroud of Turin, and for centuries it has been the subject of various speculations and hypotheses.
In today's episode, we will explore the question, is one of the most sacred Christian relics authentic or not?
The known history of the shroud begins in 1353 when Geoffroi de Charny built a church in Lirey and placed an inscription, "The True Burial Shroud of Christ." It was a piece of linen measuring 4.4 by 1.1 meters, bearing a faint brownish image of a man, or rather two images, the front and the back of his body. It appeared that the body had been wrapped with the shroud, folded over the head. For some strange, unknown reason, the image of the body was imprinted on the shroud, like a poor photograph.
We see a tall man with clear facial features, a beard, and a long hair.
He has his hands crossed over his loins, and we can clearly see the wounds on his hands and feet from nails, which is typical of Roman crucifixion.
Interestingly, there is a stain on one side of the torso, corresponding to the description in the New Testament that speaks of Christ being pierced with a spear.
But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. This opens a new topic related to another sacred Christian relic, named the Spear of Longinus, better known as the Spear of Destiny, but we'll discuss that in a separate episode. Today, we are interested in the shroud in which Joseph of Arimathea placed the body of Christ.
As I mentioned, to this day, Scientists are not sure how the image on the linen fabric was created. But before we get to that, I think it is important to trace this relic in chronological order.
Let's start from the crucifixion of Christ sometime around 30 AD. After the crucifixion, the shroud was folded and presented as a portrait to hide the sinful fact that it was a burial shroud. It was taken to Edessa, then a thriving Christian community and now a historic city in Turkey. In 57 AD, the city's ruler reverted to paganism and began persecuting Christians, and the shroud was hidden in a niche in the wall behind the gate of Edessa. Although Christianity was allowed again after about 120 years, the existence of the shroud was forgotten. In 525 AD, massive floods in Edessa killed much of the population and destroyed many public buildings. The shroud was rediscovered during reconstruction. Another version suggests that the relic was found 3 centuries earlier during the reign of Constantine. In 943 AD, the Byzantine army besieged Edessa and offered to spare the city in exchange for the Mandalene. Thus, the shroud came into Constantinople's possession. Around 1045 AD, it was discovered that it was a burial shroud, probably when someone removed it from the frame to restore it. In 1204, when the Crusaders sieged Constantinople, the shroud disappeared again.
What happened next is unknown, but one hypothesis is that it fell into the hands of the Knights Templar.
In 1291, after the fall of Acre, where the Templar treasury was located, the shroud was taken to Sidon and then to Cyprus. In 1306, the Templar treasure was moved to France by Jacques de Molay. On October 13, 1307, however, the Templars were arrested by King Philip, who was eager to lay his hands on their treasures. In March 1314, Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake along with Geoffroi de Charny, the Norman head of the order. It was Geoffrey who built the church in Lirey in 1353, where the shroud was displayed. After his death, the relic became the property of his son, also named Geoffrey. It was exhibited, probably to raise funds, in 1357, but Bishop Henri de Poitiers ordered its display to be stopped. In 1389, another exhibition provoked the anger of Pierre d'Arcis, the Bishop of Troyes, who asked the king and later the Pope to be given the relic.
He insisted that it was forged by an artist around 1355. However, the Pope sided with the Charny family and the bishop's attempt failed.
In 14,000, after the death of the young Geoffrey de Charny, his daughter Margaret married Humbert of Villers-Exel, and the shroud was handed over to him for safekeeping. It was kept in the chapel of Saint Hippolyte in Doubs and was displayed annually on a field along the Doubs River. At the same time, the canons of Lirey were making efforts to get it back from 1443 and even managed to excommunicate Margaret from the church, but failed to obtain the shroud. When she died in 1460, the relic apparently was already in the possession of the Duke of Savoy, who had given Margaret 2 French castles in exchange. In 1502, it was exhibited in the castle of Chambéry, where 30 years later it was almost destroyed in a fire.
In 1578, the shroud was taken to Turin, Italy, where it remains to this day.
On May 25, 1898, the relic was publicly displayed again, and Turin photographer Secondo Pia was commissioned to photograph it. Around midnight, in his camera, he pulled the first of 2 large plates from the developer.
What he saw nearly made him drop it. Instead of the unclear, faint image, there was a real face. clearly recognizable. But he was looking at the negative, not the actual photo.
This could only mean one thing. The image on the shroud itself is a negative, so when reversed it became a positive, or simply put, a normal photograph. It turned out that if the relic was authentic, Pia was looking at a photograph of Christ. The Duke of Savoy, King Umberto I, heard the news and a long line of noble visitors queued up at the photographer's home. You can imagine that most of them were 100% convinced that the relic was authentic. 2 weeks later, a journalist published the story and it spread worldwide.
This is how it reaches us today, the people of the modern age.
As you can see, this is a rather complicated story, with the Templars and specifically the de Charny family playing a central role. A little later, in the episode when we examine some hypotheses about the relic itself, I will return to the topic of the Templars. Whether the shroud is authentic or not, we do not know. However, one thing is clear. The information contained in the shroud is so complex that the chances of it being forged are 1 in 1,000.
Its study has become an independent science called sindonology, from the Italian word sindone, meaning shroud.
Research on the sacred relic began as early as the early 20th century. In 1977, microanalyst Dr. Walter Macron requested samples from the shroud. The results were disappointing for believers. He reported that his microscopic examinations revealed traces of iron oxide and paint particles on the shroud. This led him to conclude that it was a forgery made by an artist. In the same year, when the samples were taken, specifically in 1977, the American organization STURP, Shroud of Turin Research Project, was founded.
This team consisted of world experts in various scientific disciplines, numbering 33, exactly the age of Christ.
They concluded that the shroud did not contain any artificial colorants or inks, which invalidated the thesis of an artistic forgery. The official conclusion states that the image on the shroud belongs to a real person who was crucified. It was also proven that the stains were indeed blood, but how the image was imprinted remained a mystery. Samples also were taken for radiocarbon dating, the results of which were released in 1988. The samples were distributed to 3 laboratories located in Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich. The conclusions were that with 99% certainty, the fabric of the shroud dates from 1260 to 1390.
This means that it is a forgery, but the question remains: who, how, and why was it made? Let's first consider the hypothesis in response to the question, how was the image on the shroud made in the first place?
One of the main ideas is that this effect was achieved through radiation or ultraviolet rays. However, whatever debates there are, everyone agrees that the source came vertically from above, over the covered body. There is even a claim that the required radiation for such an effect on linen far exceeds the power of all known methods today. For believers, the explanation is very simple. The source of this radiation or ultraviolet rays is not of earthly origin. Divine power, or more specifically divine light, is involved here. There are also researchers who are somewhere in the middle, so to speak. They believe that the image appears after a massive surge of energy at the moment the body passes through the fabric, possibly at the moment of resurrection.
Whatever claims we consider, the fact is that by the end of the 20th century, it was impossible, at least according to our known technologies, to create the image on the shroud in a laboratory environment? Come on, let's be real.
This complicates things a lot, even if we hypothetically assume that it is not Christ's image and was created in the 13th-14th century, as the radiocarbon suggests. But perhaps the key to the mystery lies precisely in the dates between 1260 and 1390. It was during this period that the shroud appeared in the newly built church in Lirey by Geoffroi de Charny, the descendant of the legendary Templar. But who is depicted on it? Who is this legendary figure closely associated with all the events around the Templars, their treasures and secrets?
The question itself implies the answer. Many believe that the image on the Shroud of Turin is that of Jacques de Molay, the great master of the Templars.
In short, the Knights Templar is a knightly order created at the Holy Sepulchre after the fall of Jerusalem and the success of the First Crusade in 1099. The purpose of the order was to make the roads to the Holy Sepulchre safe for pilgrims.
However, with only 9 knights, it was clearly insufficient for this task, suggesting it may have been just a cover.
It is believed that when the Templars moved to the remains of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, they had a completely different goal. It is assumed that they were actually searching for ancient Jewish relics and old manuscripts. Speaking of documents, the most famous such documents from the Holy Land are the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is believed that the manuscripts from Solomon's temple come from the same source as those from the Dead Sea, but were of much greater significance. Many of you are likely familiar with this source, the Essenes, also known as the Nazarenes. Sometime during the Jewish revolt in 66, they hid their manuscripts in the caves near the Dead Sea, and according to some, in Solomon's temple, which was intended for the most valuable of them.
Whether the Templars knew about this and joined forces in searching for them in the ruins, we cannot say.
In the 12th century, the Crusaders lost the territories they had conquered in the Holy Land. The Second Crusade ended unsuccessfully, and Saladin, known to many of you as Salah ad-Din, captured Jerusalem in 1187. In the following century, another 7 crusades failed to restore Christian power, and the fall of Acre in 1291 cemented their defeat, and thus the Templars lost their reason for existence.
However, their wealth remained intact.
French King Philip eagerly awaited this. After being expelled from the Holy Sepulchre, the Templars moved to Cyprus, but the island was not a safe place. The ideal solution was to return to France, unaware of how much they were hated by the king. We will not delve into the details of the subsequent events and will return directly to the hypothesis that the sacred shroud depicts the master Jacques de Molay. De Molay was not tortured in the hall of the Inquisition, but in the Paris temple.
It is believed that the master was crucified, nailed to one of the doors.
Inquisitor William Imbert, a zealous Catholic, was likely horrified to learn that the Templars denied that Jesus was the Son of God and deemed it appropriate to crucify de Molay on the door. After the master confessed to what he was accused of, the inquisitors took him down and wrapped him in a cloth, which they likely took from the Paris temple. They laid him on the bed in this shroud, and his body was covered in sweat and blood. There is a theory here that, thanks to this mixture, the image was photographed, but this remains only a theory as no experiments have been conducted on it.
The shroud itself was returned to the house of Geoffroi de Charny before or after he and de Molay were burned at the stake.
Less than 40 years later, The shroud was exhibited in the church in Lirey, near the home of Geoffroi de Charny's grandson, who, as mentioned, bore the same name. Thousands considered Jacques de Molay a martyr. 4.5 centuries later, when Louis XVI was guillotined during the French Revolution, someone from the crowd shouted, "Jacques de Molay is avenged."
The idea that the shroud covered Jacques de Molay is the most debated so far.
Of course, its strongest argument lies in the results of radiocarbon dating we discussed earlier. But there is something important here. There are studies that indicate that the radiocarbon analysis placing the shroud in the 13th-14th century period is wrong. I will not go into detailed explanations of the studies, but I will try to explain briefly. Scientists challenging the radiocarbon analysis point out that the edges of the shroud contain 37% vanillin, while its central part had 0. This is an organic compound that degrades over long periods, sometimes over 1,000 years. The fact that the central part of the linen fabric contains 0% vanillin indicates that exceptional antiquity of the shroud. It is also a fact that when the Vatican allowed samples for radiocarbon dating, they were cut from the edges, which means that if they were taken from the center, the result would show a difference of at least 1,000 years, pushing the date close to Christ's crucifixion. It is mentioned that the vanillin content in the same linen fabric found in some of the manuscripts from this period is identical to the percentage in the Shroud of Turin.
This, of course, raises many more questions. Here comes one of the most interesting hypotheses logically following the rebuttal of the radiocarbon analysis.
Professor Alberto Carpentieri from the Polytechnic Institute of Turin believes that the image on the shroud was created by nuclear emissions caused by a massive earthquake that occurred in Jerusalem in 33 AD. Interestingly, the Gospels give us a description of such an event. A massive earthquake occurred at the exact moment of the crucifixion. Carpentieri points out that these emissions disrupt the carbon content, which confuses the samples from 1988, as they were caused by high-frequency waves resulting from friction in the Earth's crust. Thus, neutron emissions reacted with the nitrogen atoms in the linen, creating the effect we call photographing on the shroud.
To this day, the Shroud of Turin remains one of the most controversial Christian relics.
The status of official science relies on the studies of the STURP team and their radiocarbon dating. For believers, there is no doubt that this is the image of the Son of God. Whether Jesus Christ was truly wrapped in this 4-meter linen cloth, or if this is a great deception for the masses, we cannot know.
The debate will continue, and only time will show what is true and what is not. We hope that you found this episode very interesting, and if so, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more similar content. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.